again, thank you, Victor,
Hello,
for inviting
everyone.
me.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guest. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Hello, welcome everyone to Ukraine Week 233, and this is my honor to introduce and welcome Mario Corti, who joins us from Italy with a presentation titled Virtue versus Madness. Mario Corti was born in Italy, grew up in Argentina, where he developed a lifelong interest in Russia. Later on, he became a fluent Russian speaker and writer, and living in Italy, he was active in defense of human rights in the Soviet Union. From 1979 until 2005, he was a head of US-funded international Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty broadcast, where I had a privilege to listen to Mario Corti's voice good 40 years ago, or 45, through the Soviet jammers back in the old Soviet Union. And welcome, please. Microphone is yours.
Thank you, Victor, for your invitation. I'm flattered and honored. But as you probably understood, I was reluctant to accept for several reasons, above all because I have already said on different occasions all I have to say on the subject. So forgive me if I'm resorting to some rhetorical devices to present my thoughts in a somewhat different way. And allow me now here, before I start, to pay homage to Abram Ilyich Fett, a Novosibirsk mathematician and your uncle. He was originally from Odessa, now the target of heavy shelling and airstrikes by Russian forces. He became an early Soviet dissident, signed letters in defense of political prisoners, for which he was persecuted and lost his job. He was also the author of The Polish Revolution, a book on the massive socio-political upheaval led by Solidarność, very much praised by historian Mikhail Heller, co-authored together with Alexander Nekrich of Utopia in Power, a history of the USSR. The book was written anonymously. We received, I don't remember now from where, a copy of the manuscript at the samizdat unit of Radio Liberty. I edited it, wrote the footnotes, and we published it in our weekly publication, Materiale Samizdata. Very soon, the book was published in London, and I was asked to write the introduction. Only after Abram Fett's death, it became known that he was the author of the Polish Revolution. And now let me get to the main subject of my presentation. On the eve of Russia's so-called special military operation against Ukraine, we heard arrogant assurances from geopolitical experts and other commentators that Russia would never invade. When those predictions proved wrong, they were followed by calls to understand Russia's reasons. Incidentally, many of the very same people who had categorically ruled out a Russian invasion of Ukraine now just as categorically rule out the idea that Russia poses a threat to Europe. I too came close to becoming one of those who understand Russia's reasons, the so-called Russland Versteher. But there comes a moment, a red line, beyond which no explanation can justify what is happening. The moment when Zelensky waved to physical aggression. In my broadcast for Radio Liberty, after I moved from the RFERL Research Institute to RL Russian service in Prague, I was always well disposed toward Russia, its history, its people, and its culture. Indeed, Radio Liberty's programs were, in general, free of any prejudicial hostility toward Russia or the Russian people. I was thrilled when Mikhail Gorbachev launched his reforms of glasnost and perestroika. I believed that the Soviet Union could make a peaceful transition to democracy, and I didn't lose hope when Boris Yeltsin came to power. When Vladimir Putin succeeded him, I thought the revolution has run its course. Now comes the restoration. History has witnessed this pattern before. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. I published a long series of articles on Soviet and Russian history from the late 80s and the beginning of the new millennium, arguing that Putin's restoration, following the uncontrolled acceleration under Yeltsin, was a necessary step towards stability rather than a tragedy. History proved me wrong. As it turned out, they were not 1 step backwards, but many. Even when events began to take a dangerous turn after the war with Georgia and Russia's recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, I failed to react as I should have. I remained too cautious and too slow to recognize where events were leading, even after the seizure of Crimea and Russia's intervention in the Donbass. At the same time, having devoted my entire adult life to Russia, its language, culture, and history, and having spent decades working in a Russian-speaking environment, I absorbed, at least to some extent, the arrogance and condescension with which many Russians regarded Ukrainian history, culture, language, and the Ukrainian people themselves. So often dismissed as younger brothers. I came to view the history of Eastern Europe and Eurasia through a Moscow-centered lens, developed a Moscow-centered view of the history of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. Yes, I too share that patronizing sense of cultural superiority held by some of my colleagues. I deeply regret this and can offer no excuse for the attitudes I once held. My outlook changed fundamentally only after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. As I once remarked, Putin turned me suddenly into a Ukrainophile. When reflecting on today's crisis, we are often reminded of the admonishments of the past. Allow me, therefore, to quote two lines from a poem by Francis Petrarch, cited by Niccolò Machiavelli at the end of The Prince. I'll say that first in Italian. Virtù contra furore prenderà l'arme, et fiel combatter corto. Virtue will take up arms against madness and cut short the warring. From the very beginning of the invasion, I argued that NATO countries should provide direct military support by deploying combat-ready contingents on Ukrainian territory, boots on the ground. In my view, this would not have constituted an attack on Russia or a war against Russia. Such forces would have been deployed exclusively within the internationally recognized borders of a sovereign government. European and American troops would not have crossed into Russian territory. I believed then, and I still believe, that such a step could have brought the war to a much earlier end. Nunquam periculum sine periculo vincitur. Danger is never overcome without danger. It did not happen. No country and no voluntary coalition of NATO members took up arms alongside Ukraine to help bring the war to a swift conclusion and drive back the invader. Not the United States, not the United Kingdom, not France, none of the powers that together with Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, thereby undertaking to respect and guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity. They missed the moment. The response of the Western democracies was marked by inconsistency, hesitation, endless debates over defensive versus offensive weapons, and a profound lack of resolve. Convinced that Russia would have overrun Ukraine within days, many effectively wrote the country off. Even the proposal to establish a no-fly zone was quickly abandoned. As Garry Kasparov said recently, why can't nature shut down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory? When military assistance finally arrived, it came reluctantly and was burdened with restrictions. Western leaders often declared that military assistance should enable Ukraine to defend itself, but not to counterattack and certainly not to win. For months, Western governments insisted that the weapons they supplied must not be used against targets inside Russia, lest they be considered parties to the conflict. The refrain was always the same: we are not at war with Russia. The prevailing assumption was that the Kremlin must not be cornered, lest it escalate the conflict still further. The rat shouldn't be trapped in a corner, otherwise he will lash out. Russia must not be humiliated, they said. Putin must be given enough ramp. At the same time, politicians and a significant portion of public opinion across the West called for negotiations. Many argued that Ukraine should surrender territory in exchange for peace. Predictably, repeated attempts to negotiate with Moscow produced nothing. The result was precisely the opposite of what they claimed to seek. By refusing to confront the aggression decisively, they prolonged a senseless war. Their determination to avoid what they portrayed as a direct confrontation with Russia only increased the cost and duration of the conflict. In trying to avoid war, they brought more of it upon themselves. This is pure madness. I have already expressed my views on Donald Trump's abandonment of Ukraine following his return to office. But allow me to repeat myself once again. We have heard members of his administration repeat misleading Kremlin narratives. Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy Jr. has claimed that Ukraine's 214 Revolution of Dignity was a coup d'etat financed by the USA. Trump's real estate buddy Steve Witkoff and his special envoy to Moscow argued that the occupied territories of Ukraine should belong to Russia because they are Russian-speaking. Trump himself has gone so far as to suggest that the Ukrainian president, a dictator without elections, started the war. In February, the US objected to calling Russia aggressor on a G7 statement marking the third anniversary of Russia's attack on Ukraine. At the same time, it declined to co-sponsor a UN resolution supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemning Russian aggression. The unfortunate reality is that this administration has become a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda and disinformation, evidenced by numerous statements from its members and the president himself. Let me add only a few observations. Trump continues to insist that Putin wants peace, even though it is evident that the Russian president, having failed to achieve military victory, now hopes, with Trump's assistance, to secure at the negotiating table what it failed to win on the battlefield. During their lengthy telephone conversations, Trump has repeatedly assured Putin that he wants to help broker a settlement. Very recently, we heard Trump say that he is not sure about letting Ukraine produce Patriot interceptor missiles domestically under, under American license, which Ukraine desperately needs to defend itself from Russian daily missile attacks and survive the next winter. Because, as Trump said, he wants the war in Ukraine with Russia ended. Tough toward the weak, yet submissive before the bully, the American president is pressuring Ukraine to accept almost any peace agreement, surrender territory and elements of its sovereignty, so the sanctions can eventually be lifted and business with Putin's Russia resumed. And a few days ago, we read that Vice President Vance started putting pressure on the Ukrainian government not to bomb Russian oil tanks on the Black Sea. I meant Russian oil tankers on the Black Sea. Equally troubling are Trump's efforts to drive wedges between America's European allies and its NATO partners, fostering uncertainty, instability, and discord within the Democratic Alliance. In doing so, he appears to be advancing objectives that closely mirror those pursued by Vladimir Putin's Russia. We also here in Europe, as well as in the United States, deceptive voices cloaking themselves in humanitarian and moral rhetoric. They argue that by supplying Ukraine with weapons, the so-called collective West, in pursuit of its own hidden interests, is sending Ukrainians to certain death. These are wolves in sheep's clothing. Whether knowingly or not, they serve as Russia's accomplices, a fifth column within our own societies. The words betray not compassion, but profound disrespect for the Ukrainian people. They deny Ukrainians the dignity of choosing their own destiny. For Ukrainians are fighting for their liberty, their independence, and their very existence as a nation. They fight because they refuse to be enslaved by Russia. They fight to prevent the Russification of their homeland and the destruction of their national identity. And we know something else. Even if Russia were to occupy the whole of Ukraine, the Ukrainian people would not abandon the struggle because no occupying power can extinguish a nation's determination to be free. Allow me now to complete Machiavelli's quotation from Petrarch, che l'antico valore nell'italici cor non è ancor morto. For the ancient courage has not yet perished in Italian hearts. These verses became a topos that would echo through the centuries. For instance, in the Polish national anthem, Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, kiedy my zwijemy. Poland has not yet perished so long as we're still alive. And later, in the Ukrainian anthem, Ще не вмерла України і слава і воля. Ukraine's glory has not yet perished, nor her freedom. Despite pressure from false friends urging Kiev to yield to Moscow demands, Ukrainian diplomacy was repeatedly forced to make the best of an extremely difficult situation. Confronted by the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Russian army, the systematic bombing of civilian targets, the abduction of thousands of Ukrainian children, the war crimes committed by the enemy. Despite the immense difficulties, Ukraine succeeded in developing and producing its own weapons, including unnamed ground vehicles, to compensate for shortages of personnel, as well as long-range drones and missiles capable of striking targets deep inside Russian territory. Damaging energy infrastructure, arms production facilities, and key logistical hubs. Ukraine halted the enemy's advance. In several sectors, it liberated territory previously occupied by Russian forces while making significant progress toward isolating Crimea. Amid these immense military, economic, and political pressures, including internal economic, social, and political problems, Ukrainians had no choice but to make a virtue of necessity, virtue against madness. Remember these words. They capture better than any other words the essence of the Ukrainian resistance against a ruthless and unscrupulous invader. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you so much, Senor Corti. We are so delighted that you could be with us tonight. And if any of our viewers, we have viewers right now from US and from Ukraine, and I myself thank you for mentioning, of course, my uncle. We remember the story, and it feels again part of history where we are today in the middle of new cycle of history. If any one of us has any questions, we have a few minutes to ask. But if you hear me well, can I ask you about maybe a couple of words about the general situation, general position of Italian intellectuals today?
Well, the position of the government is well known. It still sticks to a policy to supporting Ukraine, although the support and help sent by Italy to Ukraine and the expensive for this help are the lowest ones in Europe. Italy doesn't spend much to help Ukraine. Among, well, intellectuals are divided. I must acknowledge that probably, I wouldn't say great majority, but probably at least there are more rumors. Those intellectuals who, if denying that they support Russia, they do, as I said at the beginning, understand Russia's reasons. Going back to politicians, you must know that the Italian government is a coalition of parties. And although the Prime Minister sticks to the policy of supporting Ukraine, one of the parties in her coalition, the League of Mr. Salvini, is definitely pro-Russian. And they keep almost silent for the moment because of several purely internal Italian reasons. But we know for sure that they are pro-Russians, and if they had more power, they would change the government's policy in favor of Russia. The same thing happens among the opposition. The opposition also is a coalition. The so-called Democratic Party its majority is also supportive of Ukraine and against the aggression. But one of the members of the coalition, the party so-called Cinque Stelle, the 5 stars, is definitely pro-Russian, wants to stop sending arms and any other help to Ukraine. So here we have a strange situation whereby part of the government is against supporting Ukraine and also part of the opposition. And this is may sound a paradox, but this is our reality. Russian propaganda is spread very much in Italy. Despite sanctions, Russia Today, which is sanctioned and shouldn't have any space in Italy, still continues to organize propaganda meetings on the territory of Italy, and myself and other activists are trying to do everything we can to stop this, but so far without much success. It's a very complicated situation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see no more questions. So here, please, my co-host, Anara Tabashalieva, our historian. Please, Anara, your question.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. And as a distinguished writer and analyst, do you have any recommendation for today's young journalists and writers about situation in Russia and Ukraine and future developments? What do you think about this? And what would be very important to know your opinion?
As I have said to Victor, talking to him before this meeting, I have problems hearing. I'm almost deaf, so I didn't quite understand what you said. If you can say maybe briefly in a synthetic way, I hope I will understand.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would appreciate if you share your recommendations to the future and current day journalists and analysts how to cover the situation in Russia and Ukraine.
Well, I'm no prophet, and I distrust predictions. I have only hopes that the situation as a consequence of sanctions, which in my opinion are not sufficient, but still they have an effect. The economy in Russia will not be able to support all the efforts. And I have no hope in the opposition, not much. They can do anything. One could also only hope in some kind of an internal coup. But this is also very unlikely. Other nationalities in Russia, unfortunately, are not profiting from the situation. This unsupportable war to move forward there, and I know they exist, the aspirations to independence from Moscow. On the other side, Ukrainians are reacting and resisting to this invasion with much ingenuity, and they are doing their best, and we see some signs that if, but this is a big if continued to be supported by at least Europeans, because I do not hope much in American support, they could achieve more results and constrain Russia to back off. But let me this is a faith of mine. I believe in Russian victory, not based on logics or rational thinking, but based on my faith, the faith that I have in justice. And that's all I can say on the subject, because we have seen many and heard many analysts make predictions that all turned up to be wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mario Corti. We were very delighted to hear and see you, and to have your veteran opinion. And we hope that we will all survive this turn of history together in the fight of Ukraine, following the freedom and virtue over madness. Thank you so much for reminding us these classical tenets and ideas. Thank you, everyone who was with us today at Ukraine Weekly Meeting 233, Marshall University.
Thank you so much for inviting.